Hello, my name is Miss Amber, and I'm here today with your Thursday 12A live lesson. Now, in the last couple live lessons, I went over how to get started with taking notes, the steps, reading the slide first, then going back and organizing the information. And in the second video, I went over the resource course, what's in it, and how to get access to it if you're Step Up, MBA, how to take notes, and other resources that are just in the resource course. So today I'm going to dive right in and just get started with reviewing the first lesson in English 12A. So let me just bring it up here. And we're just going to dive right in because in the other videos, we've done all of this, reviewed all of these things. So the first lesson for English 12A is History of the English Language, and it's a big one. It's a pretty big one. So I just want you to keep in mind that I'm going to try to get through as much information as I can in this half hour. The history of the English language is a big topic. Because there's just so many years of history. And part of the reason why our language is so different is because of the different historical events that have happened over time, where people were, where they settled from. So this lesson just tries to tackle some of that. So this first slide basically just talks to you about what languages are, considering they want you to think about language. So they give you the term etymology, that's the study of the origin and history of words. And then they ask you a lot of questions about language. They want you to think about why languages are structured the way that they are. A lot of the time, languages are structured the way that they are, specifically so that people can refer to things that they interact with in their everyday life. If you live in a very hot place, you wouldn't have a lot of words for snow. If you live in a very cold place and the snow interacts with different things in your life in lots of different ways, then you're going to have lots of different words for snow and how it interacts with things. You're going to have words for how snow sits on top of certain things, how it gets pushed around, snow mounds, things like that, footsteps in snow, things like that. I know that there's the Inuit language, which famously has a lot of different words for snow and how it interacts with things and people. So that's just a thing to keep in mind. Whenever two groups of people that speak different languages come together, whenever two neighboring countries or tribes have to exchange and trade, you end up with words that blend together, that get borrowed from other cultures. And that's basically how you get language, all of these things coming together. So that's important to remember. That's the basis of everything they're going to teach you here. So they start off with telling you that English is a Germanic language, which might be surprising. English is mostly based in the same language that Germanic languages are. So that would be a lot of the Norwegian and Scandinavian region stuff. And they kind of try to show you what it is that English has in common with these languages by giving you this table here. So it's just a list of words that are similar in German, Dutch, and Swedish, and it gives you an idea of the words being related. So then they tell you about cognates, which is what this table is. This table is cognates. So cognates are words that look alike. It can be traced through different languages to an origin language, and they have the same meaning. So English, German, Dutch, and Swedish share a lot of words because they're based in the same like grandfather language. So then they talk about here, although French, Persian, and English may look completely different, they all belong to the Indo-European family. And German does as well, since English is a Germanic language. So basically, when we talk about language relationships and families, we do the same thing that we do for people in families. So we have a like a family tree, but for languages. So it says here, if you imagine the Indo-European language as a tree, English, French, and Persian would be on separate branches. So they're all different regions that were based in the same language. But English is on the Germanic branch. French is on the Italic branch, and Persian is on the Indo-Iranian branch. So just like a family tree, you start off with one main tree of the family, and then you branch off to, well, what did people speak in this region and this region? And then as people move around and those languages splinter into other ones, you get branches and branches sticking out. And that's how you get English. So Indo-European is the tree. So then we get Germanic as a branch, and then on that branch is English. And they give you a simplified tree here. And this is just to give you an example of what it looks like. So we have Proto-Indo-European. So that's basically like the basis of everything else. And then depending on what region you lived in, you've got these branches here. And then they all have different smaller branches that come off. So for the Italic languages, we get Latin. And from Latin, we get French, Spanish, Portuguese, all of those things. On the Germanic branch, where English shows up, we've got North Germanic, Swedish, Old Norse, West Germanic. And there's a difference between West Germanic and Old Germanic because the languages are not as related as everything under the West Germanic umbrella. And under here, we've got Anglo-Frisian, Old English, Middle English, and Modern English. Just as a reminder, you don't have to know what all of this is. They're just giving you an example of what a language tree looks like. It's very similar to a family tree where you would have like, a couple and then their children who they married, and then those people's children going down and down. It's the same thing, but with languages. So this is pretty much the setup that you need for them to start giving you the history of the English language and telling you where English started and where it's ended up now in terms of what we speak. So the things that are important to know is that historians and etymologists believe that the Indo-European language family began near modern day Turkey. So that's where people started actually forming words for their languages instead of just writing, vocalizing, and having like a cohesive language that refers to stuff. So basically, people who are in that Turkey area moved into different parts of Europe, and they took their languages and changed those languages to be able to talk about and discuss the things that happened while they were living there. So like if you live in Western Europe, you're probably part of the Italic language. You're close to a lot of water, you're near the coast. The weather is very specifically on the west side, influenced by the water that's on the coast. In some areas, the lands are very mountainous. All of these things, whether the geography, like what the place looks like, affects how languages develop. So all of the stuff in West Europe was basically French, Portuguese, and Spanish. But in the northern regions where it's cold, you have to sail very tumultuous waters. It's not just the coast. It's also there are islands up north in Europe that are harder to reach. And if we got the Germanic languages from there, that's where English comes from. So we have Swedish, Norwegian, Old High German, and West Germanic. So they give you some history here, and it's important to put these things in your notes just because you may get a question. Like, for example, we have people have been living in the British Isles since about 500,000 BC. That's a long, long time ago. So you might actually get a question that says, how long were Indo-Europeans who were the forefathers of English, like lived in the British Isles? And they'll give you a bunch of numbers you'll have to pick. So it says that the Indo-European Iberians, so they're giving you the names of another group of people. What they called themselves at the time was Iberians. They migrated to Western Europe from Eurasia. So they're also telling you where they came from around 6000 BC. And I know that it's a lot of numbers and information here, but it's important to understand the timeline of how long it's been since people have lived and stayed in these places. So people have been living in the British Isles since 50,000 BC. But the people who came from Eurasia, back when there wasn't such a clean divide in the continents, was 6000 BC. So all that time, tens and tens of thousands of years before they got people who migrated there and settled into Britain. They formed societies and raised animals, and it's believed that these are the people who built Stonehenge. And they give you information about the Celts, who migrated from Austria, and the region that's now known as the Czech Republic. And the reason why they give you this information is because the Celts and the Iberians fought often. And because they were fighting, obviously they were interacting with each other a lot. So that would affect the language that they speak and the type of words that they use to refer to each other. So I'm going to try to condense this as small as possible. But this slide basically goes over different types of timelines for conquering Europe and who's had an influence over Britain in particular, because Britain is where English, like the English that we speak, came from. So knowing the history of Britain specifically gives you the list of how it's changed over time. So they start with 55 BC. Julius Caesar tried to invade Britain, but the French at the time and the Celts joined forces and defended their territories. Eventually, though, they were conquered by the Romans in AD 43. So we're already jumping from BC to AD. And then the Romans ruled Britain for over 400 years. And since the Romans literally spoke Roman, which was a branch of Latin languages at the time, that influenced English a lot. So then the next thing that they tell you is that the Romans ruled for 400 years. That's a lot of time for their language to change, to be influenced by the Romans. And in 449 AD, the Germanic tribes from up north threatened the Roman capital. So they left Britain. And after that, Britain fought back and forth with lots of different people. And every time they lost or were conquered, they had to change their language to fit and make room for the people who conquered them and how they spoke, so that people could communicate and understand what they were saying. So they give you the list of different types of people who move in from, remember, the Germanic languages come from the north. So the people that came from the north to conquer Britain were called the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and the Frisians. So those were the names of those people. So they moved and pushed the Celts out to Scotland and Wales. So basically, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland are where the Celts ended up settling. And the people who were Germanic from the north ended up taking Britain. So you'll hear a lot of the Anglo-Saxons mentioned in this lesson. And part of the reason why is because of all of the groups that they listed here, the Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians. The most powerful two in order were the Angles first and the Saxons. So both of these groups together are called Anglo-Saxons. So Anglo-Saxon was basically the society that gave us very, very old English. The language that the Angles spoke was called Anglish, which sounds very similar to English, just pronounced a little differently. So the language that they spoke along with the Saxons when they were the ruling tribes was Old English. So we're starting to get somewhere. We're actually getting to the point where we're calling the language English instead of just talking about whatever the conquerors spoke when they came. So Old English was the language that was spoken after the Romans took over Britain and then left and was pushed out by these four groups. So Old English is like the very earliest version of English, and it reads like a foreign language almost. So like they give you an example of Old English versus modern English, and it's actually very difficult to read it and understand um, what was going on at the time. Old English is the same language that Beowulf was written in. And you guys are going to read a translation of that a little later in this class. But it's just to give you information on why the language is so different, and why it has to be translated, even though it's English. Old English here it's not even possible for you as a student to read it because it's just so different. So then they give you more history. The Anglo-Saxon culture began to change when Christians came in from Central Europe and tried to and successfully converted Britain to Christianity. But the reason why this is important is because it's another interaction that Britain is having with other groups. So before Christianity was something that everyone practiced, there were a lot of different gods. Some of them were shared with the Celts. Some of them were just gods that are not very well known anymore. But there were a lot of different gods that were worshipped, multiples, like pantheons, like when you think Greek pantheons. Other cultures also had their own pantheons. So for them to convert all the way to Christianity means that their language changed to push out the old ways that people spoke about gods and potentially like magic and miracles, to make room for new references that we recognize now from Christianity. So then we move on to Middle English, and they give you another date from in the late 1700s AD. Scandinavian tribes invaded Britain. And these were the Vikings from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. So these are from like way, way, way north and a little east in Europe on the islands. So the Vikings invaded and intermarried with people of the British Isles. So that changed the language again, because now everyone from all of these different places that are invading Britain have to be able to communicate with the people who already live there. So it says during this period, the language of the Anglo-Saxon people mingled considerably. Mingled means mixes with the language of the Scandinavian invaders. So we started off with English being a Germanic and Norwegian thing. Then we had to add a little bit of Roman influence. Then we had to add the Anglo-Saxon influence, which is how we get Old English. And now we're adding in Scandinavian stuff. And they give you a table here of English words that are Scandinavian in origin. So you can see the similarities between English and Middle English and the Scandinavian influence. So after the Scandinavians settled and married people in Britain, the language changed, and that's how we got Middle English. So now we get this big section on the French influence in English language. So even though Scandinavians started the trend moving the language towards Middle English, French is a really huge influence on English. And I'm sure you know there are lots of French words that we use and borrow even today. So basically, the French king decided to try to take over Britain. The long story short is that the Scandinavians took over a lot. Like the Vikings took over a whole lot of Britain, and there was one small section that fought back. What they did was promised that if the King of France helped them, that they would give the land that they win in the war to France. But the long story short is the guy that asked for help ended up not doing it. He lied. So the French king was like, oh, well, if you promise me this land and you're not going to give it to me, then I guess I'll fight you for it. And that's how we got the French fighting the Battle of Hastings. So they fought the English there, and the French won. So for 200 years, the king of France was also the king of Britain. So you had a lot of like French nobles, people who had money investing in Britain, trying to use the territory to make money and stuff. So people had to have a lot of their language affected by French as well, because 200 years is a long time. The ruling classes, government officials, and highly skilled workers spoke French. So English became the language of the lower class. So basically, if you were poor, you spoke English. If you were rich, you spoke French. But if you interacted between being poor and rich, like say you worked for a rich person, you had to know enough French to understand what they were telling you to do. So that's how we got a lot of French influence in our language. So a lot of people make fun of English for having influence from so many different languages, but this is exactly why. There were a lot of wars and there were a lot of battles and just a lot of cultures interacting with each other in Britain. And that's what influenced a lot of how English turned out today. So here we have a table of different words in French that have influenced English. It is a lot bigger than the other tables we've been looking at. Okay, so then it says here by the 14th century, French had fallen out of favor. So it got to the point where you weren't considered a noble just for knowing French and that kind of thing. Most people spoke English. And I mean, that makes sense. If you have nobles and people who work, and those are the only people who speak French, that means that there's a lot more people who just work the land and farm who know English. And if the majority of people know English and only some people know French, they're going to have to learn. The people who speak English are going to have to learn French, but the people who speak French are going to have to learn a lot more English to be able to interact with the people who are like doing low level work. So at this point, the 14th century, that would be the 1300s. English had become the language of the land, so most people spoke that. But now, with the French influence, it was very different. So a lot of the time, people who are scholars, so basically people who study languages, will tell you that the period from 1150 to 1500 is considered the Middle English period. So that's basically where Middle English started developing and then became popular and was the main language that people spoke. This Middle English is a lot closer to the language that we speak today. So it's a little easier for us to understand. So like whenever we make references to really old, like thee, thou, what dost thou have done, like sort of thing, we're referring to mostly stuff from Middle English that got carried over into modern English. So they give you a little listening tidbit for this. So you can kind of guess what some of this means if you take it line by line. Juan that April with he shower suit. So we've got a couple things here that are recognizable. Juan and when are very similar. That is the same. And then we have April just spelled with some extra letters. And we've got with, that's the same. His is just spelled with an extra E. And then we have shower suit. So like, it's not exactly, this is the hardest part. This would be sweet with fruit. So it's similar enough for you to be able to guess kind of the same way you would a foreign language, but it's still not the English that we know today. So let's see. We've got modern English here. So modern English is the English that we know, starting with Shakespeare and the way that he wrote English. I know that some of you have a hard time understanding that too, but we do actually get to the point where you can kind of look and guess at what people are trying to say without having those complicated bits like in Middle English. So by the 16th century, that's like 1500, that's the end of the Middle English era. We get Shakespeare. There were no dictionaries or anything like that. So spelling varied greatly. People spelled things the way that they sounded. So for some people, that would be different spelling. They tried to spell out words the way they wanted them to be said. Shakespeare made up a lot of different words that we consider staples in English today. And that's the most important part of that. By the 18th century, that's 1700, people were worried about how quickly the English language was changing. So Geoffrey Chaucer, you're going to read an excerpt from something he wrote. The Canterbury Tales was really famous for Middle English, but only 400 years after that, people were having a hard time looking back and understanding his work the same way that we have a hard time looking back and understanding his work. But it was only 400 years later, not like 800, you know. So they felt like English was changing too quickly. So a bunch of writers got together, and they give you a list here: Jonathan Swift, Samuel Pepys, and John Dryden. These people wanted to be able to write in a way that could be remembered forever. So this is when people started making dictionaries. So I give you the description here. Jonathan Swift wanted a language academy to regulate English so that it wouldn't change so much. They basically said, well, I want people to read my stuff forever. So all of this changing, influence from interacting, we're just going to have to say no to that. We're not going to do it. What we need to do is actually have a group of people that regulate how English is spoken to make sure that we don't just adapt whatever it is that other people are doing. We got to have some rules. We got to have some rules in here. So that's how we got the dictionary. In 1721, Nathaniel Bailey penned his first dictionary in the English language. So this was just recognizing a lot of the words that people use, official spelling so that they wouldn't change too much. And some years later, in 1754, Samuel Johnson wrote the more extensive dictionary of the English language. So Johnson didn't just record words, he also traced them back to the earliest known origins. So this was closer to like the sort of dictionaries that we use today. Let's see. And then it says it included excerpts from great works and usage notes. So just rules on how people use things. Hey, this is the first time we saw this. This is a classic example of using this word. So again, the examples that we have in dictionaries now. So this basically just talks about grammar books being made. And it's the same thing. It's just books of rules for English and how people are supposed to use things to give examples. Okay. So we are gonna jump into the Anglo-Saxon period really quick. I think this will be the last thing that I can finish for today. So the Anglo-Saxon period, now that we know like what modern English has evolved into and how we got dictionaries and stuff, the Anglo-Saxon period is what we're focusing on, because once you start reading Beowulf and some of the other things from this lesson, that's where this information comes together. So the Anglo-Saxon period, if you remember, is after the Romans left Britain, and they were conquered by the Vikings, and the Vikings pushed the Celts back, and then the Anglos, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians came in and took over. So basically, the Scandinavians took over a lot of Britain. So they give you a couple dates that they want you to use to keep in mind. They just said, you know, some of this stuff, the dates are hard to pin down, but they're going to reference AD 449 as the beginning of the Anglo-Saxon period. And from here, you just get more information about basically the Anglo-Saxon period. So pretty much after that, you just get in this video, it's 6 minutes and 50 seconds long. They go over the actual history of language and how it developed in a little more detail. So like these last slides just gave us a general description. Oh, here's who took over what, here's who interacted with who, but this gives you a little more detail in terms of the actual history of what happened. So the kingdoms that came up, so like after the Romans left, the kingdoms that came up, how they consolidated or grouped together to form most of what we recognize in Britain, the dates for different wars and stuff. And it also gives you more information about the Vikings and how they contributed to things. and the interactions between different people in history that influenced how Britain actually came to be. So that information that I gave you about um, the guy who wasn't conquered by this, who wasn't conquered by the Scandinavians and ended up getting help from France to recapture the rest of Britain. All of that information is in this video. So it just gives you the breakdown of the actual events that led to people being conquered or having like alliances and stuff like that. So after that, we get to the excerpt for this lesson. And just to go over it in general, because this is the last this is the last thing that we're going to go over from this lesson. Beattie's Ecclesiastical History of the English People. This is basically the history of Britain that we're basing all of these events on. The Vatican, which is part of the Catholic Church, sent people to Christianize Britain. Remember back when the Germanic peoples were staying in Britain, they all worshiped lots of different types of people. Even when the Romans came in, they all had different gods, and the Anglos, Saxons, and Jutes and stuff all had their own gods. But after the Pope sent people to convert others to Christianity, it took 100 years to do that, to get Britain to be mostly all Christian. But Beattie is from the church, and he basically wrote things that he knew about history at the time. So this is one of the most like well put together accounts of history that we have. It's hard to get information about history when you're looking at written works because people lie, people will make stuff up. You have to try to figure out where their biases are so you can figure out if they're doctoring things. For example, Beattie is a Christian, so anything that he writes isn't going to be kind or nice to the people in Britain who weren't practicing that at the time. Everything that he writes is going to have a Christian lean on it, even if the people who lived there at the time weren't Christian at all. So even with that, this is the most accurate like source document that we have for the history of Britain. And he starts with Julius Caesar trying to conquer Britain way, way, way back, and then moves all the way into the Anglo-Saxon period. So that's a long time to be able to have stuff written down about history. And that's why we actually use this. So they give you information about Beattie and his background, like as a monk, as a person who works for the church. And they give you some excerpts from some of the stuff that he wrote. He didn't only write about history, he also did poetry and some stuff like that. So they give you some of the excerpts from that and explanations of what that is. And that's pretty much the rest of the lesson. You're going to read Caius Julius Caesar, the first Roman who came into Britain, and also Caedmon's Hymn, which is a story in a poem that he wrote. And it is about Caedmon persevering through the grace of God. So you can see his influences there in the writing. But since he gives you a little bit of history and he's written things that aren't history, it's a really good sample of what people used to write like at the time. And it's a good example of being able to show what life was like for British people way, way, way back then. The reason why knowing this stuff is important is because it gives you information about how and why English developed the way it did by giving you more information about how people interacted at the time. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing for today. Now, I know that that was a lot of information, so make sure that you take time to go back through that tutorial and write down those dates. They give you a lot of information between the lesson and the video just about the events that happened. This whole lesson is just about the history of the English language. So this is the information that you're going to need to know. some of the excerpts you're reading in other lessons as we move forward are going to be from people during those time periods as history move forward. So they just needed you to understand the background for what they're throwing at you and why they're throwing it at you. So we'll pick up in the next lesson next week. And this is Miss Amber signing off. Good luck with your English course.